Yeah, there we go.
All right. All right. Well, welcome to the Tall and Taller podcast. This is Lucas and Ethan. We're both tall and we like history. Here's like a brief introduction to our podcast. We just want to talk about history. We are an incredible source.
We are not. We most certainly.
If you were to give us a test on Roman history, we'd fail it. I'm just going to preface it by saying that. But we do enjoy it. We've listened through the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan. It's fantastic. And we have like a general kind of idea, I guess, of what we're talking about. So, and we're funny. So, so that's why you should listen. So people have been asking us for a while to do a podcast just because we both like to talk about history and other stuff, and people consider us intelligent, which is
a vast overstatement.
It's a great lapse of judgment. But anyways, this specific podcast was sparked by I was at Bible study a couple weeks ago, and this girl walked up to me. Her name was Allie, and she was like, "So is it true that guys constantly think about the Roman Empire?" And it's absolutely true.
It's 100%.
We constantly think about the Roman Empire. And she was like, "Why?" And she followed up with the question of, "Well, then why did Rome fall?" And I believe that those two questions, one question answers the other. I personally, so a lot of people debate whether Rome continued existing after 476 AD, after the technical fall of the last Roman emperor. I mean, you could debate that the Ostrogothic Empire or the Holy Roman Empire or the Byzantines or something like that were a continuation of Rome. But Rome is ultimately not. It's not an empire. It's ultimately an idea.
Absolutely.
It's excellence in thoroughness. Like Rome was constantly on offense, and they were also constantly doing defense correctly. They were constantly playing.
And they were constantly hungry. Like, especially when the Emperor Trajan came into office, he didn't look at the vastest empire the world has ever seen and said to himself, "I'm satisfied." No, he made it even larger.
Yeah, exactly. The Roman Empire only existed because it was a machine that ran on offense. So, like, if you look at any part of the Roman Empire where it wasn't doing well, it was mostly because the Romans were playing defense.
Yes.
And they didn't have something to fight, something to attack. Because when they didn't have something to fight, some external threat, they oftentimes would just attack each other. And that's ultimately, I guess that's a part of the reason why Rome fell, is they ran out of people to attack, or they just kept getting beaten from a lack of thoroughness. Yeah, I don't know. I Googled the other day, I was like, well, what caused the fall of Rome? And one of the main actors listed is Diocletian, which is ironic, and kind of taken out of context. So what we're talking about today is Diocletian and the Tetrarchy, which is
it's like soft mud back there.
Okay. Diocletian. Diocletian was an interesting guy. He's considered like the second to last good emperor.
Yeah.
Aside from like Constantine. My chair is sinking now. Maybe we shouldn't have done this on like mulch. But Diocletian was an interesting guy because he had a bunch of reform. He's known as a reformer, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately his reforms was the whole reason the empire was able to survive for another 150 years. But he ultimately created the problem that caused the fall of the Roman Empire. So he split the empire in two. Like, unofficially, he's like, it's still united, but it's split. And ultimately, the fact that it was split in the first place caused the eventual schism.
Yeah. The reason why he split it was because he looked at Aurelian. Now, Aurelian, my boy Aurelian, he never makes the top 5 good emperors because he only reigned for like 3 years. But basically, Aurelian's whole thing was like Rome was being attacked on all fronts, and wherever Aurelian would go, that front would do well, but the other 3 fronts would start to fail. And Diocletian looked at that and said, Aurelian was a great man, but he was only a man. And so that's why he split the empire to save the empire.
Exactly. And, like, okay, for those of you who don't know, the Tetrarchy is basically the
Rule
Roman
by
Empire.
four.
The rule by four. The Roman Empire, after the crisis of the 3rd century, was kind of in shambles. And so Diocletian, when he became emperor, he split it into four like mini empires. And the basic concept of it was like Constantius, Aurelian, Diocletian, and like Gallius, the fourth guy, the fourth wheel. But yeah, essentially it was a splitting of the power. Whenever there would be a great victory, it would kind of be like everybody would share in that victory. It's like if one guy succeeded, the whole of Rome succeeded, right? But ironically, if one guy failed, it was very obviously that one guy, and everybody made sure it was that one guy. Ultimately, Diocletian's reforms, he reformed a lot of stuff, but I think we should start with how he actually got into power. So, how Diocletian got into power.
That's a good question, because I don't know.
Well, I kind of do. So there was this guy named Cassius. Okay, if I get any of these names wrong, all of you posers in the comment section are not allowed to correct me because I don't care. So there's this guy named Cassius, right? And he had 2 sons, and those 2 sons were in basically direct competition with Diocles?
Diocles? I don't know.
Diocletian. I'm so sorry. In a lot of passages, he's referred to as Diocles. That's why I forgot his name quickly. But Diocletian. So they were in direct competition with Diocletian. And what's hilarious is that Cassius. So in Roman records, okay, it said, "Hey, listen, this guy was assassinated," but most historians think he was struck by lightning. So literally, this bolt of lightning happens, kills this one dude. And suddenly his 2 sons and Diocletian are in competition for the throne. And what basically Diocletian did was he married his daughter to one of them and made the other one like a kind of like a proto-emperor, like a co-emperor. And then on top of those 2 guys, they put into command like 2 even more emperors. Mm-hmm. So at any given time there was 2 main emperors, and the number 1 emperor, Diocletian, and then my chair is sinking again.
Stay on the offense.
I'm gonna progressively move closer to the camera. But yeah, that was essentially it. Diocletian got into office after the crisis of the 3rd century, and the crisis of the 3rd century was like a time of great unrest. Like it was
absolutely crazy. The entirety of Rome was just hanging by a thread
for the whole time. They were being attacked on basically every front, and it sucked. It really sucked. And so, when Diocletian got into office, he basically stopped the crisis of the 3rd century. Like, he came into office just as it was ending, I guess is a more accurate way to say it. He didn't necessarily put it to a stop in full. But, what were you going to say?
Oh, nothing. Well, you can't exactly say that Diocletian was perfect, because upon him entering office, one of the first things he did was there were a bunch of these people called Sarmatians. They wanted to settle in the Roman Empire because they were moved from their lands by like the Huns or something like that, and Diocletian is just no, and he kills most of them.
Yeah, Diocletian did have like a lot of like enemies over the course of his war. He had there's the Samaritan front because it was like another Judaic revolt or something stupid like that. There's always some sort of a Judaic revolt going on. There was he fought the Sarmatians. He fought a bunch of guys. It was okay. So Diocletian is well known for the fact that he caused the persecution of Christians. It was basically the last big persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, because after him it was Constantius, a bunch of different. It was basically musical chairs with emperors, and then it landed on Constantine, who was the first Christian Roman emperor, and then he made Roman Christian Empire. And so he was the last guy to really persecute Christians, and thus a lot of Christian historians paint him in a very bad light. And he was a bad guy. He did a lot of really terrible stuff to Christians. I forgot where I was going with this, but basically, when he got into office, there was a lot of people who saw him as a bad guy, and my chair's again, and so there, I personally believe that there's only 2 good guys in the entire story of Diocletian, and that's the Italians and the Egyptians.
who were always evading taxes. And Diocletian's primary reform was over the revenue collection system of the Roman Empire. So, I mean, rampant inflation.
Anyways, here's my favorite part of Diocletian's reign. So basically, when Diocletian, the crisis years, had forced the currency into rampant inflation, Diocletian's like, well, I know why the coins aren't spending as well. It's because there's not a high enough silver quantity in them. And so he just kept ratcheting up the silver quantity, but as he was doing it, he was just pumping more coins into the empire. And by the end of his reign, Roman coins were like 98% silver. It was insane, but that didn't work because it wasn't the material that the coin was made out of. It was the amount of coins in the empire. And so Diocletian just eventually just threw up his arms and gave up. And so he set thousands of ministers across the entire empire, and they assessed thousands upon thousands of goods on what their value is, and he put a price cap on every single one of them.
Okay, in fairness, that only lasted from like November 20th until December 1st.
And it was not enforced at all.
It wasn't. They were like, we're going to institute price control. And so price control, for any of you who have any idea of basic supply and demand economics, is not wise.
No, it's not.
It flew in the face of economics everywhere. And so, yes, so basically, the rampant inflation actually had a genius solution created by Diocletian. So when Diocletian, when there was like inflation, rampant inflation, right? Mm-hmm. And there were soldiers that would give up a year's pay for a shirt or something like that. Diocletian thought that was stupid, and there's no real way to tax people in that sense, because it's like, what am I going to do? Tax them for $1 million, trillion, bazillion dollars? That's still not going to cut into their income because we have 1 million, billion, trillion coins. And so what he did was he geniusly developed basically a unit of tax. And so if you were, say, a rug maker, and you made rugs, right? Instead of paying taxes with coins, which have a very variable value, right? What he would do is he would say, hey, a rug is worth 1.5 units of tax. And let's say you owe 50 units of tax every year, right? That means that you give the government like an indefinite amount of rugs. I'm not going to do math right now. An indefinite amount of, like that definite amount of rugs until your taxes have been paid in rugs. And so this creates like a very, very unique problem where it's like, hey, if let's say something's worth more tax credits than another. Like let's say a bushel of corn is worth way more than, say, pigs, right? Everybody in the empire would suddenly start farming corn, right?
And then Diocletian was like, no, you have to save your position. So Diocletian is like the earliest example of like Orwellian stuff where like you have to save your job and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's funny because like Diocletian modeled medieval serfdom for the next like millennium on accident.
I know. It all started with him.
It really did. Like if you look at any part of medieval history, you can trace a lot of it back to Diocletian. And it's like this really interesting scenario where, yeah, he actually was like the founder of a lot of stuff that would shape the course of the next millennium. Yeah. So, anyways, yeah, there was the guilds. He would force people to stay in their guilds for the rest of their life. It was very authoritarian. The thing with Diocletian is that he was very much an authoritarian and not much of a libertarian. And if you know anything about authoritarians, right, they're based, and they're awesome, right, and they're great. The only problem is they have no understanding of economics. They have, like, no basic understanding of economics. And that's what took the biggest hit during Diocletian's reign, during his reforms. Diocletian
didn't have a sinking chair.
Diocletian did not have a sinking chair. But he did, however, have a sinking empire. And so what he did, that's a fantastic transition. Diocletian did have a sinking empire, and so what he did was he instituted a sort of two-government system, where it was basically like, up until that point, it had basically been, hey, you're the provincial ruler of this area, you command the military, you command the economy, you command social, whatever, right? And that's how Rome stayed together for so long, was because it had individual autonomous rulers in each area. And so what he realized is that when somebody is entirely focusing on military, their economy suffers.
And so what he did was, over each state, there would be a provincial governor and a general. And so, and obviously, like, you know, the outer states had more of a focus on military, whereas the inner states had more of a focus on government and economics, right? He basically turned some states of the Roman Empire into engines and the other into tanks, swords basically. And so, like, it was a brilliant, brilliant idea, and this principle is what kept Rome alive for the next 150 years. Just this fact that he was able to constantly be on offense while also constantly building the empire. And so, as previously stated, he, like, you know, created tax credits. And tax credits, you know, like, you know, or unit of taxation, right? Yeah. And up until this point, the Roman Empire had basically, like, not cared about taxing. It was because the Roman Empire always had enough money. And that's the thing, like, they had a very economical government where they didn't waste a ton of money. They would just use as much money as they had, and if, you know, if some people were evading taxes, they just didn't care, because it made some people happy to evade taxes. It made some people happy, and they didn't need it. And so when Diocletian came into office, he was like, all right, everybody's going to pay taxes, and everybody's going to pay this much taxes. And so, like, suddenly there was this insane drop of revenue in the Roman system, and he put that to good use. And also some stupid, wasteful use, but he's a Roman emperor. He's a Roman emperor.
They're all stupid. He built a gigantic palace in Croatia, and then he died there.
Yeah, he did. And what was it? I think it was Tiberius. Tiberius was the Roman emperor who was, you know, reigning at the time of Christ's death. Tiberius said that the trick of being Roman emperor is learning how to shear the sheep but not skin it. And Diocletian was really the last emperor who sheared the sheep and didn't, like, entirely skin it. And so, I mean, other than, like, maybe Constantine. And so Diocletian ultimately did a lot of really great stuff.
He did. And on Mike Duncan's podcast, when he lists the 5 greatest emperors, he puts Diocletian always at number 4.
Yeah, and I mean, it's because he did such significant reform. Like, the Roman Empire really was falling when Diocletian was growing up, when Diocletian was a kid, right? And, like, whatever it was like
235, 245.
Probably around there. Yeah. And, like, the Roman Empire was on the brink of collapse. Like, everybody was trying to attack it, and even, like, the Roman rulers were, you know, kind of destroying it from the inside.
They were.
And so Diocletian revived a dying empire, but he ultimately implemented the Tetrarchy, which was kind of one of the precipitant factors in the fall of Rome. Mm-hmm. Because splitting it between Byzantium and the Western Roman Empire was detrimental. Because it created, like, an artificial divide for no reason. And yeah, that kind of was an issue. Hilariously, Diocletian was tall, thin, and had a large forehead, so he's literally like us. Literally me. But yeah.
Your chair is sinking.
My chair is sinking. Next time we are not doing it right here. But yeah. Diocletian's reign kind of ended in a very surprising way, where he literally
abdicated. He got really, really sick, and then he retired to his palace that he built out of, like, $1 billion.
Yeah, and it was like, and it's crazy because he's one of the only recorded emperors to actually, like,
die of natural cause.
Well, die of natural cause. Like, I mean, granted, he died kind of sickness, but it wasn't being murdered.
It wasn't being murdered.
It was just huge. Yeah, Diocletian in the Senate was also a big thing that he accomplished, where it was kind of like, you know, the Senate. So, if you don't know anything about Roman history, at the very beginning of the Roman Republic was like a bunch of really tribalistic small areas that needed some sort of, like, each one needed their own voice in the grand scheme of things when it came to the empire or the republic. And so they instituted the Senate, and the Senate was it was almost on par with the, you know, head cheese, right? Even when, like, the Roman Empire started up and there was, like, a Roman emperor, like, Caesar Augustus didn't really care about what the Senate did, but he pretended to care.
That was the key.
That was the key. That's what made them happy. And so they were just a bunch of rich aristocrats who kind of didn't have any part in Roman history over the course of the empire at all. Until, I mean, like, Calvinus, Balbinus, and Pupianus, which that's their actual names.
And those were like, that's like the last time the Senate had any power, like realistically speaking. And so when Diocletian came in, and Diocletian was like a huge, like, everything has to be this way for everybody all the time. And he was like, he never had his hand out of a cookie jar. He was touching everything in the empire. And so when he came into office, he was like, oh my gosh, the Senate does absolutely nothing. And instead of giving them stuff to do, he gave them less power. And so that kind of made them sad. And they were like, and the Senate was like, we did something at one point in history, we swear. But realistically, he didn't care. And the Senate really just got less and less power over the course of the rest of the empire. And I can't really think of a time in the future of Rome where he had.
Yeah, they hardly talk about the Senate for later in the later part of the empire because there was just nothing to talk about.
They just did nothing. I mean, like, Julius Caesar had a lot of conflicts with the Senate. He was ultimately murdered by the Senate.
He was.
Like, at the very beginning of Roman politics, like in imperial sense, you know, in 34 BC or whatever, when the Roman Empire finally started, it was ultimately the Senate who was kind of the thing that kept the emperor in check. And after the decline of the Senate, it was kind of just like the will of the people, the Praetorians, and the next guy who kept the emperor in check. Because if the current emperor sucked, the Praetorians would just murder him, or the people would just murder him, or the next guy would just murder him and become the emperor, you know? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of just how it was. And so it was, yeah, I mean, the Senate just slowly lost its power, and Diocletian was kind of the final executor of the Senate. Whether or not that was super detrimental in Roman history, we'll never really know, because they never really did anything for like 300 years prior, and the Roman Empire was totally fine. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I had something else to talk about, but I forgot it.
Isn't it funny how it works that way?
It is funny how that works that way. Yeah. So basically, this is kind of how our podcast is going to work. We're going to kind of just research a bunch of stuff and then talk about it. Next week, we're thinking about doing the crisis of 69 AD, which is, you know, the year of the four emperors, which is a very interesting time in Roman history. But Diocletian was ultimately, he's just a great emperor to start with learning about, because it's like the classic Roman emperor story of giant crisis, Gigachaticus Maximus, imposing great policy, and then dying and everything goes to crap, right? That's essentially the cycle of Roman history. If you learn about Diocletian, you learn about basically everything else about the Roman Empire, essentially. Yeah, Diocletian had several. He just reformed everything. He reformed how the military worked. He reformed how the judicial system worked. He reformed how the political system worked, and all that stuff. So, yeah. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you for watching.